Hello, this is Derek Taylor, HUM 2020. Once again, Introduction to the Humanities. Already made one video for you that goes over the parameters of the course and the various aspects of the grading and everything. So this video, the longer video, I'm going to go over the materials in each module, which you'll be reading and watching for every week, and just talk about the humanities, what they are in general, give you an introduction to what you're supposed to learn and everything, what you're supposed to get out of it. And hopefully, again, part of the rationale of the course is to sell you on their importance. So you can judge for yourself how good I am at this. So with that said, let's get started. We'll get into this and talk about some of the things I've assigned for you. If you look at the computer screen, you can probably see now you're going to have in each of the modules I showed you this in the other video, a link or a page where you have the assigned readings and materials. And the first module you're going to complete is the module called the Humanities and the Good Life. And the good life is something usually associated with philosophy, right? Okay, what is the good life? What does it mean to live a good life? What's the best form of life to live? That sort of thing. And the humanities are the traditional focus for this in academic terms. You normally don't go to, you know, um, I don't know, an engineer to find out what what you think a good life is, right? And that's no denigration of engineers. They do important work. Um, you maybe perhaps and even you can fit that into a humanistic worldview, engineering, but for the most part, you go to things like philosophy and the arts, the creative arts, drama, literature, film, painting, music, things like history, things like literature, all those things that help us discover, through experience and reflecting on it, what those things are. And in fact, one of the key terms you have in this first module gives you the definition of the humanities. They deal with human things, human culture, and the readings on the materials I've assigned for you give you a more specific vision of this. It's basically my vision. And a few of these things, I'll go through each of these and bring these up. The first thing you have there listed is the National Foundation on the Arts and Humanities Act of 1965. Again, one of the things we want to do in this course is convince you that people in the real world actually take this seriously. Well, here you go. Congress back in 1965 passed an act establishing a foundation, establishing money. They're going to use your tax money to pay for the humanities. Why would they want to do that? That's the question you want to ask yourself when you read through this. Why would the government be involved in this? What does the government get out of it? What does society get out of it? Right? The humanities, even though they're about human things, that they're also about the things as well. And you might ask yourself why a government might be interested in that. They give you reasons in that actual document. The second one's the most important one here. And if you were in my in-person course on campus, this is the one I put a lot of stress on. This is an interview with Ian McGilchrist. I'll bring it up here real briefly. I don't know if you can hear this or whatever. Oh, that's not the interview. No, you have this interview with Ian McGilchrist. It's a Canadian broadcast. And Ian McGilchrist is a neuroscientist who also has his PhD in literature. And he's written several books. The one they're asking about in this interview is called The Master and His Emissary, in which he has this very interesting theory of the brain, the human brain, and its evolution, that that the left and the right hemispheres are sort of in tension or in conflict with each other. That even though the brain, both parts of the brain are involved in all the things that we do as human beings, she says this in the interview, that the left hemisphere of the brain and the right hemisphere of the brain see the world in different ways. The left hemisphere, you'll see this is important. He thinks the world is too left hemisphere oriented, particularly modern societies. He talks about some of the problems that modern societies get themselves into with things like mental illness, and he thinks he can explain part of this through this idea that the left brain is different. And the big difference, I'll give it to you, is that he thinks the left brain is too narrowly focused. Like, well, left hemisphere of our brains tends to be activated when we're very narrowly focused on a single problem. We blot out everything else. We tend to ignore everything else. It's when we want to get a real focus on something so we can manipulate it, so we can control it, right? When you're working on a problem in your study or at work or something, you tend to use that. The right hemisphere, by the way, and that was the title of the talk, is that he thinks the right hemisphere of the brain should quote unquote rule the world. Why? Because he thinks it's the part of our brain that gets activated more when we see a wider view of things, when we're not so fixated, when we don't see things or people as some things that we need to manipulate or control. And he has an interesting argument for this. You don't have to take it all on faith. I'm not saying you can't criticize the guy, but it's an interesting way of thinking about the world. And the way I think of it is, I think the humanities are the sort of right hemisphere way of looking at the world. Technical arts. One of your key terms is the liberal arts for this module. Well, the liberal arts were traditionally meant to make you free, right? They're meant to teach you general knowledge about human nature, not teach you specific technical skills, right? That's the difference. That's the humanities are not about technical skills. They're about these general principles about human nature and human society and reflection upon them. And I think you can make a case that's what the humanities are for. I think you can make the case, using McGilchrist's idea that that's why humanities are necessary. So I put it in there for that reason. The next one up here is Technology Alone is Not Enough, a little article by Jonah Lehrer, who is a journalist. It's about Steve Jobs. If you don't know who that is, Steve Jobs recently, in the last 10 years, passed away, was the founder of Apple. So if you like, Mac, if you like those types of technology, you can thank Steve Jobs. It talks about how, Steve Jobs was influenced by the humanities, what he thought of it. You wouldn't think, well, what does a computer genius need with art or literature? The little article will show you it actually meant something to him, and part of his success as a businessman, besides being just a tech genius. And Scott Samuelson, his little essay, Why I Teach Plumber Plato's. He's a teacher at a community college like me. And he talks about the liberal arts and the humanities and what their value is, and tries to make the case that they're not just for elites. They're not just for the people who are gonna run our life, basically, right? It's not just for politicians and power brokers. They're for everyone. And in particular, why? And this is the traditional idea of the liberal arts. They're supposed to make you quote unquote free, right? And hopefully, what you read in there will give you a hint of what do we mean to be free from, right? And so that's his little article. And then finally, a TED talk, about 20 minutes, a little long, but it's pretty good, by Jill Sonke, who I think. That feeling when you. Gee, that's an ad. That's not the actual. If you can read that, but Jill Sonke's talk, Why Medicine Meets Art. Jill Sonke, I think she was at the University of Florida, but she may still be there, where she works with patients. She talks about her work with patients, helping them heal from physical or mental trauma using art, using music, using dance to actually help heal people, which there is, and she'll mention this in there, scientific evidence that actually does aid in the healing process. And so it's an interesting, very interesting talk. One of your key terms is in that video. She'll talk about flow state and what that is and why it's important. So it's an interesting reading there. And again, all these materials get to introduce you to this idea that, okay, the humanities are worthy of your attention, right? They're not just silly, subjective stuff. I still have a lot of students, when they write papers and stuff, they'll still make that mistake. I'm not saying, by the way, here everything that is in the humanities is subjective. Quite the opposite. There are plenty of factual things about, even objective things about the humanities, but they are geared more toward the sort of broad view of things. They're not as specific. They deal with the big questions in life. I think that's why they're important. So that's humanities and the good life. That's the first module you'll be looking at. The next two will deal with the topic of religion, ritual, and devotion. I'm dealing with two separate, well, actually three really. In this module, ritual and sacred space. You have basically two sets of materials. I'll go over these first. You have a decent number of things here. Most of these, 4 of these are actually short videos. The first one is not. The first one is a little Substack post. I like Substack, and this is by Ted Gioia. who is a jazz musician and music critic and author. And he gives you what he calls 13 observations on ritual. And he wants to explain why he thinks ritual is important in human life, even though it's become attenuated in the modern world. It's a very interesting. He's an interesting guy, has a lot to say, and he talks about ritual being important for stability in our lives, of bringing stability to our lives. And in particular, he'll talk about this in the context of our modern technology, which, as you'll see, he thinks, and he's correct in a lot of ways, is very disruptive. And so he'll talk about the value of it. And he thinks of it, as you can see, they can't get the subtitle there, as an antidote to a lot of the things that we have going on in our modern world with our technological advances. So that's Ted Joya. The next one's, again, a short video. I guess I'll bring it up here, which has to do with, Arnold van Gennep, who was a Belgian sociologist, one of the sort of founding fathers, I guess, of sociology. And his concept of a rite of passage, a ritual, and it gives you the definition in the key terms. A ritual is a sort of any sort of ceremonious act that involves repetition. And he talks about rites of passages as being these rites that have to do with markers of transition in our lives. Anything that marks a transition, from one social state to another. That's one of your key terms. We'll give you the little brief definition of that. It's kind of interesting. Maybe it's something you could talk about in the discussion fora. You've all been through, by the way. You've all had to go through something like a rite of passage in your life. It's going to be interesting to think about. And I probably should stop here just for a second. Okay, why ritual, right? Why are we talking about this topic? Ritual is kind of I guess some people may see it as a primitive thing, but I think it's a basic thing to human society. And it's something that you can study through things like anthropology or religious studies. And I think because they're so common, that's one of the things I want to talk about in this course is things that are common to all human cultures. All human cultures have rituals. And so it's an interesting thing to think about, the things that bring us together. Lots of things that divide, cultures are different. They're unique. So they're going to be, divisions between them, but they do have common features. Maybe not totally universal all the time, but definitely common. And I give you some examples of rites of passages in these next two videos up here. One is by National Geographic. It's the Apache sunrise ceremony. It's basically a rite of passage for young women in Apache tradition, the Apache tribe. And it talks about this and goes through what's involved in the ritual. Goes through, and you pay attention when you look at it. What kind of rituals? Because there are many rituals involved in this larger one, right? What types of actions are they performing during the ritual? What's their symbolic meaning, right? What function do they play? And they'll tell you some of that in the video. Kind of interesting stuff. The next one is actually a clip from the film Becket. This is made in the 1960s, older film, and it's about a film about Thomas Becket, who was a medieval archbishop in the Roman Catholic Church, who was he was murdered in his own cathedral, sort of literally a martyr. He became a saint in the Catholic Church. And the interesting backstory: he had been a member of the king's entourage. He was a member of his court or whatever. Was made the Archbishop of Canterbury, which was the major episcopal see, major bishop in medieval England. And when he became bishop, he had been the king's friend. He all of a sudden became his enemy. He began defending the church's interests against the encroachments of the king. The king wanted to take the church, wanted to control the church, basically. And long story short, he winds up getting killed by some of Henry II, who's the king, his knights. But in this, that's the background. But in this little scene, what you're seeing is, Becket was a layman before he became a priest, then an archbishop. And what I wanted you to see here, this is relatively accurate. The filmmakers at the time got the help of a local Benedictine monastery to do the ritual. And again, the ritual is not the same as it would have been in real life. As you'll see here, the ritual is performed in English so you can understand it. It would have been performed in Latin, in medieval Latin when they did this, but it would have been a much longer ceremony. But you get a sense of what it means to go from being a layman in the medieval Catholic Church to a different status, right? Going from being a layman to being a priest to being the highest sort of rank you can have in the Catholic Church, which is bishop. And again, paying attention to the symbolism, what symbols they use, what is it meant to signify, um, how do they mark the transitions from one state to another? It's kind of an interesting thing. So have you look at that. And then an example of another type of ceremony. I thought I'd give you another video to look at. This is the medicine Buddha ceremony. And it's actually a little website. It has an embedded video you can see. It's coming up here. And just talks about this sort of communal rituals performed by Buddhist communities. This one's in Philadelphia or outside of Philadelphia, which are meant to sort of, pray for the healing of apparently the whole world, right? So you're, again, it's a different ritual. I guess you could say it's not a rite of passage. It's a different, going from a state of, sickness to healing or praying. But anyway, what symbols do they use? What actions are they performing? What makes this a sort of sacred event for them? And all those sorts of questions you can ask about this. And what that does, for a community, right? Why do that? Does that do any good? What good does it do if it in fact does any? Those sorts of things. Why do communities do these sorts of things? And they all do something like this, by the way. Every community has something like that. If they don't have a healing ceremony like the Buddhists do. And then finally, a little reading. It's a little bit not difficult, but a little more involved by a textbook here, written by a guy named George Melch. George Melch, anthropologist. A little article on ritual and superstition in baseball. The title they give there is Baseball Magic. And it's about all the sort of little rituals and superstitions that baseball players have. I don't know if any of you out there are athletes or played baseball, have family members who play baseball. They have lots of little weird rituals. They're kind of weird, a lot of these baseball players. And George Melch talks about magic in here. And he compares what these baseball players do to being a form of magic. And as you'll see, he has a very specific definition. Actually, we have the definition in key terms. Magic is an appeal to invisible forces to sort of influence the world. And he gives you a very interesting idea as to why they do this. What are they trying to influence when they do this? Very interesting little article. So I hope you enjoy that. So that's the materials for ritual. I gave you one other thing to look at for ritual and sacred space, which is a little slideshow. Come up there on sacred spaces. And this is, you'll have a question to answer for your notes. It gives you a slideshow of a bunch of different sacred spaces. And I want you, as you look through this, take a look, don't rush through it totally. Take a little bit of time, look through each of these sacred spaces and ask, questions. How is it used by worshipers? What do you do there? What's the building's relationship to nature? Because most sacred spaces tend to have a fairly defined relationship to nature in one way or the other, to space and everything. And then the symbolism of it. What objects are used in worship? What the shape or geometry of the space suggests to you? And it gives you some 40 odd different types. It gives you one from prehistoric and ancient sites. I think one's from, if it comes up here in a second. It's taking longer than I thought. I think, sites built for polytheistic and monotheistic religions. And then ones that are made for multiple religions. And so that's the second other thing you have to look at for ritual and sacred space. Like I said, I begin with this because it's basic, right? How we organize our lives spatially matters, right? The type of building you study in matters. The type of building you live in. Trust me, you go from a cramped apartment to a home, you'll notice, even in a non-sacred sense, what sense, how we arrange our space matters. It matters for a lot of reasons, right? And shapes the way we live. Therefore, it's something that's fair game to the humanities. And then the next module, and you'll have to do. I did mention this in the other video. You're gonna be doing several of these modules a week for the most part in this course, a couple of weeks. So the other religion, ritual, and devotion module is on a specific ritual, that of pilgrimage. And so you have the key term to talk about it there. But the assigned readings have some interesting ones here, I think. Little sort of explainer website on the Hajj. The Hajj is one example of a ritual. This is the annual. This is not the annual, but the pilgrimage to the city of Mecca in Saudi Arabia that all Muslims must make once in their lifetime. So it's a sort of universal pilgrimage required of all believers who come from all over the world to be in this place. It happens every year. Several million people show up in Mecca. It's a really big affair, to say the least. And that's one example I give you in these readings of a pilgrimage. And pilgrimage, of course, is someone that goes to a sacred place, right? Someone that journeys to a sacred place. That's one of the key terms. Then I give you a couple of different sites that have to do with the El Camino de Santiago, which is a famous pilgrimage site in Spain. It is the site of well, it's supposed to be the resting place of St. James, called the Stella. And that's the shrine there where people go to venerate the saint when they go there. But it's become a much wider thing than this. In the modern world, people go on this pilgrimage for a lot of different reasons, other than religious ones. But originally, and it still is a Catholic religious site for that reason. And give you a selection from a travel writer named Robert Sibley from his book The Way of the Stars: Journeys on the El Camino de Santiago. We'll talk about his experiences on the El Camino de Santiago real briefly. And again, one of the things to give you this reading is, okay, so what do people get when they go on pilgrimage? Why go somewhere, right? Why go to a sacred place? Can't you do sacred things at home? Perhaps, I don't know. But he'll give you a little bit of insight. Someone, by the way, Sibley is not religious at all. So he gives you that sort of perspective on these things. And then just a little sort of background Google Arts website on the Camino de Santiago. It has some, I don't want to sign up. It has some background information. It also has wonderful images. That's the bigger thing. It shows you some of the routes, obviously, on the Camino de Santiago. Shows you what the actual basilica looks like when you get there. Gives you some background on where this all comes from. So if you want to look at that, it's kind of interesting. And again, really the biggest reason I gave it to you is it has all these beautiful images. And so it gives you a sense of like, and look at those mountains, right? This is where you're hiking when you go on a pilgrimage, right? So a sense of the physical aspects, which we can't do online that well, of what a pilgrimage is like. I thought would be interesting. Also give you some PowerPoint images to show you the routes people take. They take multiple routes. If it comes up there, you're not. Oh yeah, there it is. That people take from Camino de Santiago, and as well as some more images, some interior shots of the actual cathedral itself. The next three actually, little sources have to do with the Shikoku pilgrimage, which is a Buddhist pilgrimage in Japan. There's a series of 88 temples, hence the title of Sibley. It's Robert Sibley again, excerpt from his book, The Way of the 88 Temples, Journeys on the Shikoku Pilgrimage. There's this sort of path of 88 temples that goes around, I'll show you the map in a moment, of Japan, dates back to the 9th century. It's very ancient, as is the Camino de Santiago and the Hajj. They're go back to the first millennium. And he talks about the Sibley going on the Shikoku pilgrimage, right? So he's been on the Catholic pilgrimage, goes on the Buddhist one, and you'll see he has some experiences, described some in his, and then this is the selection from The Way of the Temples. So talks about those things. They also have up there, by the way, he actually has some photos, just so you can point this out up there. You can see what he looks like and everything. Robert Sibley, traveler there. And then I gave you, again, another little photo essay, New York Times photo essay to look at and click on there. Just give you some more images of the pilgrimage path, right? What it looks like, what you might see on the travels, to give you a sense of what it looks like and feels like for these pilgrims. And then again, here's again the map of the Shikoku pilgrimage. As you can see, a little bit different than the Camino and the Hajj, which is sort of a universal thing. It's sort of a circuit of places around this island in Japan, right? And then finally, one last thing for pilgrimage, a little longer reading about Christopher McCandless. This is an article by John Krakauer, who turned this article into a book, which was eventually turned into a film back in the early 2000s. I've seen the film. It's a great movie. It's a real story. Christopher McCandless, if you don't know, was a trust fund baby. very successful family, had lots of money. He gave away his trust fund money and left, sort of ditched his family and went off into the wilderness of Alaska. You'll read in the actual article why he did this, and wound up dying in the Alaskan wilderness as a result. And the reason I give you this, and you'll get a question to answer when in your notes, when you're doing your notes, and or something you bring up in discussion. The author Krakauer will compare him to religious pilgrims. Like, he's not religious at all. That's not the backstory of his life, but he's searching for something, as you'll see in the article, and that prods him to go out and do this fairly risque thing. He just lives all by himself in the Alaskan wilderness for months on end. He mostly succeeds, by the way. You'll see it's tragic the way he dies, but he makes a direct parallel. He says this is almost like a pilgrimage. So it's an interesting thing to think about, because when we're talking about the humanities here, when we talk about ritual, we're talking about, in some ways, patterns of behavior, patterns of life that shape us even outside of their original context, patterns of thinking, patterns of acting. And that's one of the things that humanities can do for you, is identify, the parts of our society, the parts of our lives that are shaped by these sorts of patterns. It's interesting to think that that's, in a way, what, Christopher McCandless was doing when he took off into the Alaskan wilderness. So some interesting stuff. Hopefully get some good discussion going for you guys. And so the next two have to do with memory, heritage, and identity. You'll have two sets of readings here, and actually the first one's on oral tradition. And you might ask, okay, why are we talking about oral tradition? We live in a literate society. I thought this was an important, interesting topic because, today with all this digital technology, people don't read as much anymore. They don't write as much anymore. Becoming, in a weird way, almost not illiterate, but post-literate, right? We all write less, we all read less. And, oral tradition is the oldest form of, if you want to put this way, technology of remembering a society's identity. And so I thought it'd be an interesting idea to compare that to a more modern one. We'll get to nationalism in a second. But the assigned readings are actually two things here. It's the readings, and then around here you have a video to watch, or the movie. But up here you'll have a few things. This is CADA film notes. You're going to have to watch a film called CADA, The Heritage of the Griot, which I'll get to in a second. And this is the film notes and viewing guide for it. Film's not that long. It's like an hour and 20 minutes. This takes you to some notes and gives you some background on that film. And I'll get to that in a moment. But these other three articles have to do with oral tradition, oral memory. This one I always find fascinating. I don't. My students quite appreciate it as much. By Patrick D. Nunn. It's called The Oldest True Stories in the World. And it's about how ancient peoples, when I say ancient, I mean really ancient, recorded stories. And he's talking about stories that go back, that record events that go back several thousand years. In fact, he says it seems that there are stories, some oral stories that are still told today, by the way, can go back as far as 7,000 to 10,000 years. And he gives you some fascinating examples in this. We tend to think of oral memory and oral traditions being very unreliable for obvious reasons, right? We all know it's easy to misremember things. But he talks about how certain societies, and there are certain things that go into this, not every society can do this. It's an interesting thing to consider why, but some manage to keep these really ancient traditions, not only just telling the stories, but passing them down through song or through ritual or through dance, that really did record real events that really did happen. We can prove it. It shows you in the article, thousands of years ago. So it's a fascinating, I think, comment on, even in our literate world, do we still need oral tradition? Well, I think you still can do it. We still, of course, communicate through speech. I guess for the time being, I don't know. And I hate to think of a future in which everybody was just texting, but I don't think that'll happen. We all want to talk to people, right? We have oral culture, oral tradition, because we need human presence, right? I know you're taking this course, more ums and ahs. I need to try to stop doing that. Taking this course online is more convenient, but normally you learn things from people around you through face-to-face communication, right? The third one up there is an interesting little backstory on the American classical scholar, Milman Perry. This is the little article, talks about his, let me go again, talks about his achievements. And he was a classical scholar made famous because he discovered something about the ancient poet Homer. Haven't heard that name. It's kind of in the news. The filmmaker Christopher Nolan made a version of his epic poem, The Odyssey, recently. Well, people before the 20th century, well, for a long time, wondered, who wrote these poems down? Did they have was Homer a single person? And one of the things that Milman Perry discovered, you'll read in this article, is that they weren't written down originally. These poems were actually epic poems, orally told originally. They were written down, obviously. That's how they come down to us from the ancient world. But he, as you'll talk about, he'll decipher characteristics in the actual poems that were meant to help oral poets remember things and tell these stories. And of course, Homer tells the story of the Trojan War, which, by the way, there were wars fought in the Bronze Age that might kind of sort of have something to do with the story of Odysseus and with Achilles. I mean, not the exact same thing, but they were actually based on almost certainly real events, real memories of things. So it's interesting, very interesting article in that regard. Then finally, one on Rory Boland by Rory Boland about the Irish and how the Irish people have been trying in the last several years to, well, one, prevent the loss of their native tongue, Gaelic, their Irish Gaelic tongue, and to recover it, but also to recover storytelling. The Irish are kind of known as great storytellers, and he talks about the reasons why traditional storytelling declined in modern Ireland and how people are trying to sort of overcome that. That was a little interesting view of this, especially given the background for the Irish and things they've gone through in their history. So that's those materials there. The next sort of page should bring up, it's not bringing it up on my firmware, but it's not loading. It should load right in the page, but if it doesn't, you can click on this link there. It should bring you to a website which will show you the film, where you can view the film, Céda, the Heritage of a Griot. It's right there. Yeah, it comes up. It's not that long. It's 94 minutes. The film is about a young boy named Céda, and his life gets disrupted. He's living in modern day Africa, and what happens is, you can see the description at the bottom. His life is kind of disrupted by this person named Jeliba, who is a griot. And griots are, that's one of your key terms, traditional West African storytellers who are supposed to keep the lineage, the family lineage of the families they're sort of assigned to, or they're a part of. And he comes to inform this young boy about his lineage. And part of the story is he's actually a descendant of Sunjata. Sunjata is a semi-legendary figure. He actually existed. We do know he's actually existed in medieval, what we today Burkina Faso, the medieval Mali. There was a Mali Empire. He was the founder of the Mali Empire. And so the young boy in the film finds out he's the descendant of this, great king or whatever. And the film is kind of weird. It flashes back and forth between Céda, modern day, the boy Mabo is actually his name. I'm sorry, the boy Mabo and his modern day life, and the actual epic poem, the Epic of Sunjata. And this epic poem, the Epic of Sunjata, again, it's not like Iliad and the Odyssey. It has never been written down. It's just told by these griots in West Africa. There are several versions that have been transcribed. You can find a copy of it on the internet pretty easily. But what happens is, when this griot comes into the boy's life, all of a sudden he begins sort of, ditching his studies. He doesn't care about, his modern life so much, and this causes conflict in his family, and that's kind of the setup. But it gives you an interesting perspective on what is a still ongoing oral tradition that really exists in the world. So that was kind of interesting. So those are your assignments for reading and listening assignments for memory and identity and oral tradition. The next uh, um, uh, next module deals with another form of identity, a more modern one, that of nationalism. And nationalism, as you're going to see, one of your key terms, it's not totally a modern idea, but associated with modern forms of nation state. And a lot of these things have to do with this. I also giving you, along with nationalism as a concept, the concept of invented traditions. And I give you this one reading here by Eric Hobsbawm, who is a historian, little selection from a book called The Invention of Tradition. And it's the introduction where he talks about what he means by invented traditions. And the reason why he's talking about invented traditions, an invented tradition is something that is one of your key terms, but it's basically something that arises in a society when there's been a break with the past. They feel the need to reconnect with a past they've kind of lost track of. And that's usually normally how people talk about nationalism. Again, at least since the 19th and 20th centuries, right? There are these traditions that are kind of, if not totally made up on the spot, they tend to emerge in historical time frame. They are meant to sort of reconnect people with their past. Again, as you can kind of imagine, some scholars are kind of skeptical about this or cynical about it because a lot of times these types of nationalist rituals, and that's a lot of other rituals in a lot of ways, they tend to be kind of partisan sometimes. They're definitely, sometimes they're invented by politicians and things like this. But it gives you an interesting way of thinking about these, this form of identity, which is, again, has some connection with a distant past, but it's not like an oral tradition, which gets sort of handed down, continuously. You don't really know who started it. It's kind of impersonal. We can date and tell you who invented this or that thing a lot of times when we're talking about invented traditions. And nationalism is one of those things. Because nationalism, what we're talking about here, is something that begins with the great revolutions of the 18th and 19th century, the American Revolution, later on the French Revolution, multiple other revolutions in the 19th century in Europe. The next little article there is an article by Andreas Wimmer called "Why Nationalism Works." He's a political scientist, wrote this article a few years ago, but he makes this argument. He's going to talk about nationalism. He gives it a fairly narrow definition, but he says basically modern forms of nationalism are really the basis in some ways of all modern governments, modern nation states. And he talks about why that is. He talks about why nationalism has been successful and why he doesn't think it's going away. It's a very interesting article. Get something out of it. And then for the rest of the sources, we're going to address one particular example of modern nationalism, that of Hindu nationalism. This article here by Andrea Malji gives you the background of what is Hindu nationalism. It gives you some of the history, what the Hindu nationalist movement is, where it comes from. If you don't know, the current government in India there's a Hindu nationalist party. They'll talk about it there, the BJP. I can't remember the exact name of it, but it is the current ruling party in India. Has been for, I want to say, 20 years now. It's been a long time. He's the Prime Minister Narendra Modi is very wildly popular in India, but they're definitely nationalistic with all that entails. They give you the background, talks about some of some things that have gone on in India under its governance. The next three have to do with aspects of Hindu nationalism in modern India. This one here, I will not try to pronounce that name. There's a little article on what's called Hindutva pop music from the website Al Jazeera, and it talks about the rise of these singers of pop music inflected with Hindu nationalist ideas, stuff that's actually pretty anti-Muslim in a lot of ways. Muslims make up a large minority in India, which is again, Hinduism is the sort of ancient religion of that region, one of them anyway. And Hindu nationalists, as you'll see, Hindu nationalism is about the promotion of Hinduism as the sort of national religion of the state. And so it gives you some background on this. Also, a little article on the the 1971 war between Pakistan and India, which involved India, Pakistan, and the nation that became Bangladesh. Bangladesh actually was once part of the nation of Pakistan. You'll see a map in the earlier article. It shows you where all this is going on. But it talks about how each of these nations remember this war and how they view it differently, and how that memory, how their nationalism shapes the way they view things. So again, here the effect of identity, which is a powerful force on memory. And then finally, this last one's just an interview with an Indian novelist. Wrote a book called Calling Samat, which was about the India-Pakistan War in 1971. And it talks about how he came to write it, why he wanted to write it. I thought it was interesting just because of the way he talks about the war. One of the interesting things, actually, this book was actually made into a film, which I actually showed to one of my classes when I taught an Eastern Civ class one time. And one of the things about the film was that you have expressions of national pride and nationalism in the film that are very, how do I put this, compared to, like Hollywood films, very natural and sort of sincere. You don't really see it that much. Nationalism is not, a popular ideology in Hollywood, but it's perfectly natural in this setting. I thought it'd be an interesting thing to see the way this guy talks about his novel and what it meant to him and what it means to, to Indians, right? A lot of whom, they are nationalists at this point. So those are the readings for memory, heritage, and identity in regards to nationalism. So the next module has to do with nature or sustaining a good life. And this has to do with, what types of physical things you need to live, what kind of place do you want to live in, but also sustaining the community, sustainability as a subject for inquiry. And you'll have a decent amount of things to read and look at in this module. I divide them into two sections. Some readings on constructing a good life. First one's by Philip Langdon, which wrote a book on architecture many years ago now, but he talks about architects in the late 1980s trying to build planned communities that how do I put this, address perceived problems in American life, specifically how to create community, how to keep people from being too isolated from each other, how to get people to interact with each other, right? And how, the spaces you live in, right? They tend to influence you, and how much, interact with your neighbors and everything. I live, recording this right now, I live in Marion County in a kind of rural area. And I have neighbors, but they're pretty far apart from me, so I don't see them for the most part. And so again, where you live at, that depends, that it shapes your, way you interact with people. And he has a long and kind of informative discussion about practices that I think are still dominant in the architectural world about, trying to build communities where people do have reasons to talk to each other and everything, which is kind of interesting. The second one is actually a short story, Lauren Groff, called Ghosts and Empties. It's about her neighborhood. And her neighborhood, by the way, is the Duck Pond neighborhood in Gainesville, Florida. If you're taking this course, you don't know anything about Gainesville, it's the neighborhood in Gainesville. And so her short story was published in the Atlantic years ago, talking about the people in her neighborhood, what things she would see on her evening runs. Kind of an interesting reflection on how the neighborhood changes over time, how things grow, die, pass away, in that sort of regard. The third one is a little blog post by Joel Kotkin. Kotkin is he's a sort of, how to put this, demographer, I guess is the best way to put it. He writes about lots of it. He writes about things like urbanism and other those sorts of things. This is blog called The New Geography. He's talking about living arrangements in spaces like this. And the article is called Why Suburbia Irks Some Conservatives. He brings politics into this. And what he's talking about is, why some people don't like the suburbs. There's a sort of prejudice against the suburbs. You know this, by the way, if you watch Hollywood movies. Like, Hollywood movies never portray the suburbs in a positive light. It's always a place of like conformity and ugly houses and all this stuff. And he takes aim at this here, and he actually takes aims at that's usually Hollywood's associated with liberals and the left. He takes aims at political conservatives who have sort of adopted this sneering attitude toward the suburbs, and explains why he thinks they're actually a good thing, especially politically, which is an interesting take on this. So that'll be an interesting thing for you guys to read. I'm assuming most of you must have grown up in something like suburbs. I did. So I don't know what you might think of it. It's interesting to think about politically. And then I give you it's a little tour. It's actually nice little sort of virtual tour of the Duck Pond neighborhood in Gainesville. It gives you historical background. You can see here, gives you images, talks about some of the homes in the area, some of the buildings. Just a nice way to look at, okay, what a neighborhood looks like. And again, how you interact with the environment, how you interact with nature, how do you sustain that over time is something the humanities, with something we want to discuss, right? How do we live together as human beings in a particular place? Which brings me to Sustaining a Good Life, which is about sustainability. I give you this long essay by Wendell Berry. I think he's still alive. He's an author, a poet. He's also a farmer. He lives in rural Kentucky. He tells you that in his writing. And the essay I want you to read is called "The Work of Local Culture," which is way down here, I think. The wrong link. Oh no, it's right here. Yeah. So this essay here. And he talks about his local community, and he talks about the necessity of, inhabiting a place, right? Having a connection to a local area, having stories that you tell about them. And, if you don't know, Wendell Berry's a critic of things like consumerism. He's a critic of, capitalism as a practice in the United States. And you can take that whatever way you want, but he is, for my mind, the importance of what he talks about is that he talks about the importance of local communities, right? You're not really from, you're not from Washington, D.C., even though D.C. is the capital of your country, right? You're from whatever local town you came from. You're from those things. And, having ties to that, he talked about why that's important and why if those ties get sort of, loosened by economic or political or social forces, that damages, the human community there. So again, interesting to think about anyway. The next one is called the little essay called "The Land Ethic" by Aldo Leopold. Again, he was someone who's again one of the first people to write about something called like sustainability, sustaining the environment, and his land ethic is just a sort of a little manifesto about how he thinks human beings should treat the environment and why they need to treat it as you'll see, part of the actual community they live in. All right, and then next two, finally the last two are a couple of basically both are TED Talks. One by Max Stone, who is a photographer who just talks about his work in the Everglades. That's not him. Max Stone talks about his work in the Everglades, about trying to take these, and they're beautiful photographs, you'll see, of the plant and animal life there, and how he does this in order to get people conscious of the both the fragility, but also the necessity of the Everglades and the environment for us, why we need to take care of it here in Florida. I thought it was kind of an interesting little talk. And then Cynthia Barnett's little talk on hypertext and Florida's springs. She's talking about the importance of springs in Florida. Obviously, in Florida, we get most of our fresh water from the aquifer, from these springs. So there's a physical connection there. She'll also talk about, she makes this little bit kind of weird comparison to hypertext. You'll see. But again, with all under the theme of this theme of sustainability, right? How do we sustain these resources, especially as more and more people move into the state of Florida, right? Lots of people have moved here in the last 4 or 5 years. How do we do that? How do we conserve that for the future of the community, right? How do we want to just use it all up? We want to find ways to, maintain, for example, the beautiful wildlife we have in this state. Make sure our parks are available to our to our descendants and everything. So an interesting set of readings there. And again, dealing with these first few modules deal with, if you don't think of them as being as particularly humanistic, they're about the basic things, the ritual, the embodied, our embodied experience as human beings, which again goes back to Ian McGilchrist. He talks about those things in his interview. The second half of the course deals with the second half of the modules anyway, deals more with things that have to do with maybe the ethical parts of the good life, right? If the first part's the sort of physical basis, you need the ethical here. And we're talking about ethics. These next two modules have to do with philosophy in the good life. And here you're going to watch a series of videos on Western philosophical thinkers. A few of them anyway. Mostly ancient Greek philosophy. A little video on Epicurus, was ancient philosopher. There's actually a philosophical school named after him called Epicureanism. Let's see what this is about. Then maybe some of you've actually heard of, a few on Plato and Aristotle. They also talk about Socrates in the video on Plato. Does the professor. A couple on Aristotle, who was the student of Plato. These are ancient Greek philosophers who are really influential to this day, right? You probably should know something of Plato and Aristotle. You know a little more, hopefully, when you watch these videos. And then two videos on two very different modern philosophers. Both examples of what you might call, this is one of your key terms, existentialism. One on Friedrich Nietzsche, who was a 19th century German, very influential German philosopher, someone who was critical of traditional philosophy, basically the type of stuff you'll get in the first few videos, and advocated a much more, I don't know how to put this, it's definitely modern, there's the ums again, much more, you say, sort of individualistic, I guess, way approach to morality and ethics. As does Albert Camus. Albert Camus is an example, really the better example of existentialism, because Camus, one of these philosophers that talks about the universe. You know what existentialism is? You'll see it in the key terms. Existentialism is the idea that the world doesn't have any intrinsic meaning, that the world is basically meaningless, and we're left in this world alone by ourselves, and we have to sort of will our way. We have to create our own meaning by ourselves. And that's something similar is going on in Nietzsche. We have a very different view of this among the ancient Greeks. They very much believe there are patterns of meaning inscribed in the universe, and they'll talk about things like virtue and morality in very different ways than Nietzsche or Camus will. And they'll also talk about, especially when you talk about Plato and Aristotle, talk about reason. This is one of the major aspects. As you probably know, we have to know something about it, I think, of the Western philosophical tradition. They put a lot of emphasis on reason. And again, that'll be another big difference between them and these later philosophies. So you get a little bit of taste of ancient Greek philosophy and some of modern philosophy in the Western tradition in that module. To get you thinking about ethics in general, right? In a good life, right? What ethical stance do you have to take in order to live a good life? And of course, next module after that, you get some examples of, I say Eastern, it's mostly Asian, it's mostly Chinese philosophy. There's some Japanese thinkers in there as well. But some examples of the types of non-Western philosophy. You get examples, basically a few things, three things, basically. Taoism, this little video on Lao Tzu is associated with Taoism, ancient Chinese philosophical. Taoism is also a religious system as well. It's also a religion, so it's kind of different. That is one different thing about Eastern philosophy as compared to Western philosophy. But ancient Chinese thinkers. Little video on Wu Wei, which is one of your key terms. You'll see it's a very Eastern idea. I'll put it to you that way. Interesting though. And then one on Confucius. So Taoism and then Confucianism. Confucius was a was a philosopher, was a Chinese sage who lived in the 6th and 5th centuries BC. Uh, became his philosophy was sort of kept alive by his students, and later on in Chinese history became the dominant, one of the dominant, it might be the most dominant, but one of the dominant schools of philosophy and ethics within China for thousands of years. It was eclipsed briefly during the Communist Revolution in China. It's come back. So Confucianism is a going thing. If you were to study, say, modern China for, well, maybe you're a history major or even a business major, if you do business in China, help them know something about Confucius. And then, of course, we're also going to study the last part of the last 4 of these have to do, well, last 5. I remember I gave you that many videos, are on Buddhism. You have one video on the Buddha himself, Siddhartha Gautama, who's an Indian prince, as you'll see. Then on some concepts, wabi-sabi, which is a very interesting concept in Zen Buddhism. You'll have a little video on it's a man named Sen no Rikyu, who was a Japanese thinker who, as you're going to see, this is one of the weird things about, well, not necessarily weird, but things that are different between Western and Eastern philosophy. Sen no Rikyu is famous in Japan for having remade the Japanese tea ceremony. What does a tea ceremony have to do with philosophy? A lot in that context. And it's an interesting thing that they combine this ritual with their philosophical thinking in a way that I don't think Western thinkers really do at all. And then a little video on Matsuo Basho, who was a poet in the 17th century, a famous Japanese poet, wrote haiku, but also was a Zen Buddhist. And then a little brief video on the art of kintsugi, another sort of ritual that is associated with Zen Buddhism, in which people will repair broken pottery with precious metals like gold. And the video will tell you why. It sounds weird and strange. It makes a lot of sense in the context of Zen Buddhist philosophy. Which, in addition to those videos, it's a lot to do for this module. I give you a couple of things to read, not much. A couple of links here down at the bottom, make sure you don't miss these. Some selections from the Analects of Confucius. These are the sayings of Confucius that were written down by his students. There's not too much here. It's basically a sort of a series of aphorisms that were recorded by Confucius. And if you don't know, the video will tell you this, but Confucius is very, very big on harmony and order. He doesn't think he's definitely not a modern philosophy. He doesn't believe in like egalitarianism. He's not a big on equality. He believes in hierarchy. He believes in, you should give deference to people who are older and smarter and have a higher rank than you. But he also believes those people in higher rank have a serious responsibility to people that are sort of below them. And that's a lot of what he's talking about in here. He talks a lot about harmony, right? Of the student being respectful to the master, the teacher being respectful of the student, of everybody in the hierarchy doing what they're supposed to do. But he also talks about ritual a lot. Again, this is one of the reasons I wanted to start, I think, the course, those modules on ritual. It plays a big role in Confucius's thinking because he associates ritual with harmony. He means that both in terms of a social sense, social harmony, observing the proper etiquette's important for not having things break down, right? Confucius lived during a time period where authority was breaking down in Chinese history. And so he's thinking about these sorts of things. And he puts a lot of emphasis on ritual that way. So that's a preview of his. And then finally, little selections of Basho's actual poetry. And the author also describes some of these little examples of a couple of examples, few examples of his little short 3-line poems, which embody the principles of Zen Buddhism. Its love of nature, its capacity for stillness, and those other sorts of tenets. So those are kind of interesting as well. Give you a real, I figure I'd give you more stuff from the Eastern philosophy because it's more alien to you. It just kind of is. The Western philosophies seem more familiar to you, I think. And so those are the ones about ethics and philosophy. The last three tend to do with maybe some different things. The next one's on freedom. The module on freedom give you, those should be key terms. But the assigned readings are here. There's a decent amount of stuff here as well. I didn't give you a lot of poetry to read. I'll give you some poems to read here, but this is a famous poem from the 17th century. Ancient stuff, I know, by a man named Richard Lovelace. He was an Englishman. He was a cavalier. He fought in the English Civil War, which took place between the King of England and his Parliament in the 1640s. He was on the king's side. He was imprisoned, and when he was in prison, he wrote this poem in which he discussed. It's a very famous poem. It's very short, obviously, in which he discusses why he says, even though he's in prison, he's really still free. And it's something you can discuss. Okay, is he just being poetic? Does he really mean that? But he says he's free for certain reasons. We'll discuss that amongst yourselves. Next one is excerpts from the political tract by Jean-Jacques Rousseau, The Social Contract. And this has to do with contract theory. Social contract is one of your key terms. Social contract is this idea that there's this sort of implicit or tacit agreement between the people who rule a society and the people that are ruled by them. That people, this is very much a 17th and 18th century idea that the idea is that originally people give up their freedom to a government in exchange for protection, basically. Like, we can't all govern ourselves. We'll all be fighting each other all the time. We're going to give you power and authority, but you have to protect us in turn, our rights and our property and stuff like this. You may have heard of John Locke, the English philosopher. He was one of the first people to talk about this. But in the 18th century, Jean-Jacques Rousseau, who was a Swiss thinker, French speaker, wrote this book, The Social Contract, which sort of supercharged this idea. And he'll talk about, in some very strange ways, what he calls the social contract. He's trying to, what he wants to do with this, he says he's trying to talk about, he talks about this in different ways, but trying to show how someone can be a free person in a society while at the same time being bound by, laws and, the authority of the state and everything. And his ideas he comes up with here in the social contract they're influential and they're interesting, but I'm giving you excerpts. The book is much longer, but it gives you the basic idea of why he thinks, of what he thinks about how the social contract is supposed to work, and how, at least in his mind, how you can be free while still being bound by, the state, by a sovereign state. So that is Rousseau. The next one is another excerpt from the book, and this one's, you may need to use the viewer to sort of increase the size of the text. It's very tiny in print, but they're excerpts from the introduction to On Liberty by John Stuart Mill, who is a 19th century English philosopher, sometimes known as the father of philosophical liberalism. And liberalism, I need to make this point. If you're reading this, it's an important one. By liberalism, he doesn't mean what we mean today by liberalism. Liberalism today means something like, for lack of a better term, an activist government, a big government, tends to be focused on group rights and group identity and stuff like this. That's not what liberalism meant in the 19th century. Liberalism for John Stuart Mill meant, this is one of your key terms, basically the emancipation of the individual, the freedom of the individual from the state, from overbearing moral authority in society, and the protection of property rights and freedom of expression and opinion. And he's giving you, by the way, in this little excerpt here, Mill's famous for giving you reasons why, for example, you shouldn't censor unpopular opinions, why it's harmful both to the individual but also society as a whole to do that. And so it's one of the things I want you to read and get out of this text and talk about it. Because people talk about you a lot, you students, you young students, because at least in opinion surveys, you guys are a lot less enthusiastic about things like freedom of expression and freedom of opinion, at least when it's unpopular, than your parents and your grandparents were. So it's an interesting thing to think about. He does give you some reasons why you should not suppress unpopular opinions and ideas. Those are more about ideas to a certain degree. The next four have to do with human beings who were sort of political freedom fighters. The first one there is you have Martin Luther King Jr., the African American civil rights activist, and his letter from a Birmingham jail. It's kind of long. I'll give you the context for this. It's published in 1963. If you don't know, King was protesting segregation laws in the state of Alabama, even though he was from Atlanta. And he wrote this letter. He was in jail, by the way. He wrote that's why the name of the letter. He wrote this. It tells you at the beginning of the letter that he's writing in response to some of his fellow ministers, white ministers, who had criticized him because they were worried about what he was doing, because he was challenging the legality of segregation, the legitimacy of it, and they were worried about that he was undermining the rule of law, that he was basically undermining, the legal process. These laws, by the way, these segregationist laws, had all been passed by Democratic majorities, and so King in this letter is defending himself and giving you reasons why, there are times when laws passed by Democratic majorities can still be unjust, right? Because normally that's how we accept things, right? In our society, at least in theory, that if the majority passes it, the majority should rule. That's what democracy means in a lot of ways. The people have decided. He's giving you arguments, which I'll give you a hint, have to do with the fact that he's a minister, to be honest with you, of why there are exceptions to that. And he's saying this is one of those exceptional circumstances where, no, the laws are actually unjust. And that's the basis of his activism there. Next one's a little short essay by Alexander Solzhenitsyn. If you know who he is. He was a Russian dissident. He was imprisoned during the Soviet Union in what is called the Gulag. The Gulag is one of your key terms. These were political prisons in the former Soviet Union, the communist regime that ruled Russia from the 1917 up to 1991. And he talks about publishing things that might get you in trouble in a totalitarian society. He's giving advice to people that want to try to, again, how do you live a good life if everything you do and say is censored? If everything you say and do is controlled by the government, and you'll get punished if you step out of line. He tells you, because he was actually in prison. He was eventually sent into exile. The Soviets actually kicked him out of the country. He eventually came back after the Soviet Union collapsed. But he talks about, and by the way, one of your key terms is samzat. That's a Russian term. Samzat just means something published secretly or clandestinely in a regime like the Soviet Union, where you have to do it, underground to avoid detection. Otherwise, you'll get thrown in prison. And he's talking about in this, okay, what do you do? How do you protest a system that has this much control? And he talks about the big overall takeaway is in the title: refuse to lie. Even if it costs you, you have to refuse to, because if you refuse to go along with it, then you're kind of free of it, right? Then you are in a way, and you may be thrown in prison, but you're not giving in, as it were, to the system, not becoming part of it this way. Next one is, again, this should come up, I think. The government doesn't trust us here. Yeah, verified. This is a little talk that was given back in the early 2000s by an author named Azar Nafisi. She is from Iran. Funny timing. Just been in a war with Iran. I guess still is it still on? I don't know. But she is an author, and she is an emigre. She left Iran back in when she left, probably in the 1990s. But she wrote a book called "Reading Lolita in Tehran." Lolita is a famously sort of it's a controversial book for a lot of reasons. She's talking about reading controversial literature in a place like Iran, which has a fairly, you know, uh, heavy-handed theocratic regime, and the importance of reading literature in that kind of context. That's the burden of her speech, by the way. She's making the point. She's arguing that yes, reading literature can help you politically in a situation like that. That's the thing you have to ask. Okay, is she nuts? Is she right? What does literature do for you that might help you in a situation where thought and expression are controlled like that? And you know, again, example of the arts being, you know, making you free in a way. Again, I mean that's the definition of liberal arts in a way. So she has some interesting things to say, I think. And then finally, the last one up here has to do with the short biography of, but also a little excerpt of a work by a man named Witold Pilecki. That's a Polish name. Yeah, it's Pilecki. And I actually put this, I actually have you read this, partly just to get you to know who he was. Kind of an amazing person. He was a Polish officer in the Polish army when it was invaded by the Nazis and the Soviets in 1939. He fought in the Polish, you know, Polish whatever, the Polish Free Army, the Polish army in exile, basically. But the Allies, you know, Britain, France, and Germany, and everything else, Britain and France, and then later on the United States, the Free French anyway, I guess the Britain and the United States, wanted someone to go into the camps that the Nazis had set up in Poland. If you don't know, when the Nazis invaded Poland in 1939, they basically, along with the Soviets, decapitated the entire leadership class of the country. And they began building these labor camps where they would round up political prisoners and of course Jews and send them there. And all the worst camps were in Poland. And so the Allies wanted somebody to go into these camps and get some information. And Witold Pilecki volunteered to go into Auschwitz. Not once, but twice. He was there once, escaped, got out, went back. And in fact, he eventually escaped the second time and wrote a report, which is the second reading material you have here, the Auschwitz Volunteer. It's a little excerpt from the report he wrote for the Allies. And it's again, it's kind of an amazing, I haven't read the whole thing, but it's an amazing it's amazing work. I think somebody went in there and you know, he went there and you know, documented the conditions and everything. He was one of the first people to see what was going on in these death camps. Very brave man. Died, by the way, after World War II. Went back to Poland. Was arrested by the Soviets, who had installed a sort of satellite government there, and put on trial and executed by them. So a very, very brave man. Hopefully you enjoy learning about that for that module. I think we're down to the last two. Which after freedom, one is happiness and the good life. This is a topic students are always interested in. I don't know too many people who don't want to be happy, of course. But you have up here two sets of readings, videos, one on happiness and the individual. The first one's a little article by the philosopher Darren McMahon on what he calls the quest for happiness. And this is just a little sort of brief history of how people have thought about happiness, specifically in philosophical terms, from the ancient world up until, you know, modern times. Very interesting. He will talk about, you know, what people thought about their happiness, how much control do you have over your own happiness in the earliest societies, then talk about the ancient Greeks, We're talking about stuff you've already learned. You've gone through the course. Aristotle, what they thought happiness was, how it changes over time. Changes involved in things like the coming of Christianity, which slightly alters things. And then to the modern period, where things really change. He talks about why modern views of happiness are really so different from what they were in the ancient world. It's a pretty interesting, brief overview. Hope you guys enjoyed that one. Then a little bit of a lecture. I think this is the last, yeah, this is the last video you have to watch from a course up at Yale by Professor Bloom, Paul Bloom. And you only have to listen to one part of this. You have to listen to the last, I think, yeah, start at 11:16. So in about a half hour or so, a little bit of a lecture where he's going to talk about happiness in the context of positive psychology. Positive psychology, one of your key terms. Most of modern psychology originated in an attempt to understand what happened when people, when things went wrong with a person's mind. Positive psychology is the total opposite. It's basically meant to tell us why we are functioning well. And he'll give you some reasons for that. He'll talk about, research about what makes people happy, what people think makes them happy. And some interesting stuff in there in terms of his lecture. The next thing you have to read is a brief essay, again, by a philosopher who's no longer with us, has passed away. Leszek Kolakowski is a Polish philosopher. And the title itself is kind of striking. Is God happy? Now, that's an odd title. I admit that's part of the reason I chose it, but it's an odd question because he's asking, is, God happy? He doesn't mean, by the way, God in a Christian sense. He's dealing with God in a philosophical sense. There is a philosophical tradition of talking about the divine in Western life. And he's talking about a philosophical concept. He'll mention, by the way, Jesus, and I think, and Buddha in this little article. But he's asking the question, can God be happy? And he means by that, I'll give you a little hint where he's going. Can he be happy like we're happy, like a human being is happy? I'm sitting here right now. My throat's kind of thirsty. I grab for my water. I drink it. I feel happy. Does God feel that way? Is God happy in any sense? This is what he's asking. It's kind of weird. I know some students maybe find a little off-putting, but I think it is interesting. I think it raises an interesting question. So give that one to read. And then this one, again, another article, I believe, from the Atlantic. Yes, Emily Esfahani Smith, a while ago now, but makes the argument that happiness isn't that important. It's important, but it's relatively not as important. She thinks, actually, happiness is less important than meaning. And she will refer to the work of Viktor Frankl, who was a famous psychologist who was actually interned in Auschwitz. So, and she quotes him liberally, but basically her basic point, as you'll see, is meaning is important. So that's one of the things you may want to talk about in discussion is, okay, why is meaning more important than happiness, and does she make a good argument for it? Last four here. The Meaning of the Pursuit of Happiness is an article by James Rogers. This is a long one from the journal First Things, where he just talks about what that phrase in the Declaration of Independence, the pursuit of happiness, meant historically speaking in the context of the Founding Fathers when Thomas Jefferson wrote it. It didn't mean the same thing, actually, for them that it means for us. Language changes, concepts change, and they meant something slightly different. And he gives you an interesting background on this. Next one, Frank Martella, a little essay about Finland and Finnish people in particular. This has to do with public opinion surveys. People have been surveying for the last 20 years or so whole countries, right? Okay, how happy is this country by certain metrics? And on these surveys, the countries that are always at the top of the surveys are always Scandinavians, and a lot of times they're the Finnish. Finland actually is one of the countries that always ranks at the top of these. So Frank Martella is actually Finnish, and he talks about why the Finns may be more happy, what might make them happy. It has an interesting take on it, why they avoid certain things. It's an interesting little topic to discuss. The third one there is the Pew Forum. If you don't know what the Pew Forum is, it's a research center. The Pew Research Center studies does surveys on religion and public life. This is an older survey, but it's been replicated. Spiney's had been. It's 2019. That it demonstrates the relationship of religious belief to happiness, to things like civic engagement and health around the world. And it comes to some interesting conclusions. It talks about, relative, for example, correlations between religious practice, a specific type of religious practice, a specific meaning, active religious practice, and things like civic engagement. Civic engagement just means things like voting and volunteering and doing public activities to support, the community and the connections between them. So I thought it was an interesting thing. Again, these are, as all these surveys are, they're only correlations. They don't amount for causation, but they show some interesting connections between those things. So I keep with that in terms of happiness. Then finally, this is the little blog post by David Cameron. This is from Harvard Medical School, but it talks about happiness kind of being a communal thing, being a social thing, that happiness is sort of like a contagion. You have kind of known, and people have known, for a long time that, unhappiness can be a contagion, right? What's the old saying? Misery loves company. We know that can spread. Like you be around somebody, they're a downer, it brings you down. Well, the opposite is true. There's actually some findings that suggest this from the sciences, from psychological sciences. And so some interesting stuff to reflect on in terms of happiness and the good life, right? Is happiness the only thing that matters in life? Do you need to be happy to live a good life? How happy do you want to be? Those sorts of questions should come to mind, I think. Kind of getting to the end here. Last overview. Okay. Life affirmation or ending a good life, right? I thought this would be fitting as don't mean to be morbid, but our lives do have a limit. We will come to the end eventually. So I gave you guys some materials to look at with regards to, how do you want to approach the end of life? Again, you guys are young. You don't have to worry about this for a long, long time. But I bring it up partly because, this is related to how you live your life, right? If you lived a good life, you probably don't have to worry too much about how you're going to face the end, right? Because living a good life means you'll go there with a clear conscience. You'll have, accomplished the things you set out to accomplish, those sorts of things. But I thought it'd be interesting to take a look at some things here. The first materials here have to do, this is Celebrating a Good Life. This is actually a documentary. And it's a little long. It's the longest thing. That's an hour and 19 minutes, not as long as CADA, but documentary about Alberto Alonso, who was a famous dancer and choreographer from Cuba. He emigrated. He left Cuba to get out of there and came to the United States, where he was offered a job at Santa Fe College and worked there for many years. And the little documentary celebrates his life, shows him in class interacting with the students, talks about what, his contributions to dance. It's an interesting backstory. A Cuban, you don't think of a Cuban guy, Latin guy doing something like ballet, but he's actually very important in the history of dance, apparently, for these reasons. And so it talks about, because in the documentary, he passed away. He had cancer. In fact, he had cancer while they were doing the documentary and filming it. He talks about how he approaches life, how he approaches his work, how he wants to approach things as he's going to the end of his life. And in some ways, I thought it was kind of inspiring and interesting. And I also gave you, besides that, a couple of things, excerpts from the opera Carmen that he directed. As you'll see in the documentary, he directed this opera Carmen, famously in the Soviet Union once, before the Soviet Union shut it down. Didn't like what he did for reasons you'll see in the documentary. And this is the full performance. You don't have to look at the full performance. No, that's not as important, but you get a sense of what it looks like from the excerpt. And so that's celebrating his life, give you an example of that. And then finally, some pieces of artwork and literature. Jacques-Louis David, this is his painting. The Death of Socrates. We've already talked about Socrates. If you don't know, Socrates was a philosopher in 5th century Athens who was put to death by the city of Athens in 399. Socrates was, you'll see they get a little bit of this in the video, but I'll explain it here. His method for doing philosophy was not anything written. He would just go around to, well, anybody basically in the city of Athens, not just ordinary people, but, you know, powerful people like senators and politicians and generals. And he would ask them questions about moral problems, about morality, or, you know, are the gods moral and stuff like this. He would ask these people questions to see what they really knew and understood about the question. Ask them questions until he sort of drew out just how ignorant they kind of were about these things. This is sometimes called dialectic, by the way. This using questions to sort of argue on both sides of a question this way. It'd be done in written form. But it was almost a sort of adversarial thing in Socrates' hands. It made him very, very much detested, is my point. And if you don't know, Athens was involved in a long war during the 5th century called the Peloponnesian War. They lost this war. They were forced to give up. Well, they're forced to give up their democracy. They actually had the victorious city Sparta impose a government on them. They eventually overthrew this government. But when they did, they wanted a scapegoat for their failures, and they naturally pointed at Socrates. So they put him to death. Really, the charges were, by the way, that he was corrupting the youth of Athens. That he was teaching people not to believe in the gods, and also to believe in new gods, which is kind of contradictory. But he's put to death for those reasons, and he's usually really admired for the way he went to his death. And this is why you get one of the reasons you get this scene painted by Jacques-Louis David, as you can see the date there, 1787. He's a French painter, and it's usually considered that this painting has political overtone. Okay, why would painting the death of Socrates have political overtones? You note the date, 1787. Hopefully you know what happened in 1789 in France. Some people think this painting might be making a commentary on the French monarchies, absolute monarchy, perhaps broadly speaking about French society. So it's something to consider when you take a look at the painting and get a sense of it. Then a couple of poems. One is Dylan Thomas's work, Do Not Go Gentle Into That Good Night, which is a poem called a villanelle, which is one of your key terms. A poem he wrote for his father. His father was actually dying when he wrote this. And the poem, I won't give any of the game away here. The title kind of gives it away. He's basically telling his father not to give in to death. Keep going on living, right? Don't give in. Rage against the death. This is a famous poem if you've ever read it. It's one way of thinking about death, right? You get different approaches here. He's saying, no, you should hang on to life until the bitter end. And it's kind of an interesting take on things. Dylan Thomas, you saw him lighting up in that picture. I don't know if you could see it. Kind of a wild figure in some ways. But then another poem, another 17th century poem by an English poet named John Donne. I think we're almost getting to the end here. Asking here. His poem Valediction, A Forbidden Morning. And I have to probably explain this because he writes in a way that maybe not be easy for you to understand. He was a noted poet, and this poem is written in the form of a sort of, in the voice of someone talking to their lover. He has a beloved, and he has to be separated from her, and he's talking about, in this poem, why. And I think he does make the metaphor. It's almost like a death being separated from the lover, right? This is a Renaissance trope or whatever. But why that even though they'll be separated, they still will be united together. And again, it does have to do kind of by metaphorical analogy with the idea of death not being something that separates people. So again, this is the other reason to look at this. Another slight take on death here. And then and this is a selection from the novel Evelyn Waugh, British novelist, Brideshead Revisited, fairly famous novel. I'll give you some background on this. I'll bring this up. You only have to read a few pages of this. So I'll bring this up. It comes with the Internet Archive. Should bring up this novel. Yeah, and you'll start down here, bottom of page 334, and go to um, 3/4 of the way down on 339. That will get you. It's a what I gave you is the death scene of Lord Marchmain. So this novel is about this artist named Charles Ryder. During lead up to the Second World War, he falls in love with this woman who's the daughter of a Catholic nobleman, and the nobleman is estranged from his family. He's lived in Venice for all of his life, for a lot of his life, and he comes back to to his country estate in England at the end of his life. And the scene you're seeing there is okay. He's on his deathbed, and Charles is, again, as I mentioned before, his daughter's name is Julia, the one he fell in love with. Julia had been someone who had not been a practicing Catholic most of her life. In the story, as they fall in love, she begins to come back to the faith. And so there's a little bit of a conflict here. Charles is worried that if they because Julia wants to bring a priest to perform last rites. That's one of your key terms. Charles Ryder, the main character, is worried it'll kill him if they do that. The father of Lord Marchmain has also been estranged from the Catholic Church. They're worried about what's going to happen. I gave it to you partly because he's a great writer, and it's a good scene. It captures what goes on during last rites, and again, gives you another vision of okay, this is another possible vision of what a good ending looks like, right? And is that a good ending? Is it good? I don't know. Something to think about. And then finally, one last TED Talk. We do like the TED Talks here at Santa Fe in Humanities 2020. This is where's the it's right there. This is the talk by Randy Pausch, Really Achieving Your Childhood Dreams. Again, Randy Pausch I said it down there, was a professor, I believe, of computer science at Carnegie Mellon. And he's giving this TED Talk about achieving your childhood dreams. The talk is actually really about how you live your life. If you'll note this when you read through it, it said at the bottom there as well, he is actually has pancreatic cancer while he's giving this talk. He dies shortly thereafter. He gives the talk. But it became fairly became a fairly well-regarded talk because of this. And as you'll see, he has again a little bit different attitude toward the end of life and the other things you've looked at here. So that is it for the preview of these all the sources in the modules. What I'm probably going to do, by the way, I'll probably upload this to YouTube, and if I can do this, I'll actually put timestamps in the description, so you can just click on one. You don't have to watch the whole thing or anything like that. And all these only take a few minutes anyway, so you get to look at them as you go along. Hopefully, this give you a little bit of an introduction to the materials before you get to looking at them. Again, you can Google stuff. You can Google stuff. We live in that age, but still, I thought I'd give you some introduction to the materials. And I hope you enjoy some of it anyway, at least a little bit of it. I think these things are informative. I think I think these are things. Hopefully, my real goal is that one of these things will set off a light in your mind, and you'll learn to love it, appreciate it, and research it more, and make it part of your life. But we'll see. These are at least the things you'll have to do to get a grade. Anyway, so that is it for me, for Derek Taylor. Again, happy hunting with the rest of the course. I'll be in touch. Be sending announcements out to you and everything. They make some short videos to as announcements later on as well. So if there's yeah, and so yeah, again, good luck to everybody. And let's stop share here. And we are finished. So good luck and take care.